I was struck in the early part of the liturgy today of a phrase that talked about the vulnerability of Jesus, that Jesus was vulnerable. And I have a sense that this story tells us something of the vulnerability of Jesus. Because as the story comes to an end, the Jesus who has been challenged by this woman who stands and will not go away, there's a sense of this Jesus coming to a recognition at this point in the story. He has ignored Justa, excluded her with theological and proverbial claims, but she would not be silenced. Her need and the need of her daughter was too great. And it was this need which she persistently placed before Jesus, which broke through. It broke through that traditional theology that Jesus was presented in verse 24. It broke through to Jesus, and suddenly he realized, as his words demonstrate, that in fact this woman had called him to something new. Woman, great is your faith, which has challenged mine. Let it be done for you and your daughter as you have willed, as you have wished. Jesus doesn't say, as I willed or as I wished, but as you wished. And in the whole context of the gospel, he makes the wish, the desire of this woman equal to that of God as we follow the language of Matthew. She has shown Jesus what God wills, what God desires, that all should share in God's healing love. The story tells of Jesus setting aside the word or the way of God for a tradition of exclusion, and yet Justa calls Jesus back to an understanding of the centrality of God's healing word for all. Jesus was vulnerable. Jesus was vulnerable to the cry of the woman that he, in fact, had earlier rejected. Can the asylum-seeker mothers do similar for Australia, bringing us to such a moment of recognition of our shared humanity? Will we remember that we have all been, but for our Indigenous people, we have all come by boats, very recently, to the land we now call home? How many of our ancestors cried out for mercy for themselves and their children? And again, returning to the immediacy of our lives, who is it that cries out in our lives? Can we stand with the disciples and with Jesus in today's gospel and discern those places in our lives where we silently ignore, where we cry out to send them away, where we theologize, or we use very pungent proverbial statements in order to authorize our failure to respond to the cry for mercy? We can do this if we stand with the vulnerable Jesus of today's gospel, if we stand on the border or on the margins of our social world. As Jesus is presented in the gospel, we too can theologize away the call for mercy. But if we keep listening to and engaging in those who persist in their cry, then in fact we too can shift, as Jesus did, to a recognition of what is of God, that healing and wholeness belong to all. May the words of today's gospel keep echoing in our minds and hearts and find expression in our lives during the week ahead.